Yeah, I mean, the fact of the matter is that, Lebanon has been turned essentially into a panopticon, is really what it amounts to, in terms of just the sheer amount of surveillance. Now, none of these pieces of surveillance are revolutionary on their own. I mean, Israel has long had access to, for example, the phone database, the DMV database, so that license plates. I mean, all license plates are known in Lebanon anyway. I mean, back in the day, maybe about 10 years ago, you could actually get on WhatsApp and you could, send a number, a license plate number, and you would get back the information, through some bot before that was finally canceled. All that is to say that this information is available, right, and certainly for the Israelis. And along that, you have this notion that the Israelis have actually hacked into Tatra, which is the emergency network here that's used by services, like civil defense and others. And all that is basically now being filtered through, I suppose, this AI that creates patterns, right? I mean, back in the day, you would have this sort of metadata analysis of various things, of various inputs, and through that you could basically create a target list. Now all that is being done by AI using these sort of this sort of pattern recognition, and that's just one element of what we're talking about here. Because the fact of the matter is, if you look at what's been happening in Lebanon, really over the last, I mean, since April 8th, since April 16th, I should say, and then also before that, right? We are in a situation where now we're in this sort of halfway war or a twilight war, where, as Heidi said, in Beirut and areas north of Beirut, it's fine. People are going out. I mean, yes, it's subdued socially, right? But the much vaunted Lebanese resilience, right, is on display. And at the same time, in the south, it is an absolute war. The main difference this time is that Hezbollah is actually fighting, right? As opposed to the last 15 months before the conflagration with Iran began on February 28th. This time Hezbollah has actually decided to respond even during the ceasefire, whereas that was not happening for 15 months, right? Since the last ceasefire between, since the last, I guess ceasefire was, I think, 24th of November, I believe, or something around that time of 2024. So, the point here is that right now what we're seeing is total war in one part of the country. And again, as you said, Mohamad, we are talking about a huge number of casualties here. And at the same time, people are having to watch their villages. What we're seeing in Lebanon, in South Lebanon, I should say, is the same as what we saw in Gaza. This idea that you can basically just go in, raise the town or village, right, and create the equivalent of Vietnam era's Phoenix program to destroy anyone who is linked to Hezbollah, whether it is a fighter, a civil defense fighter, or a civil defense member, a banker, or really anyone else who is part of Hezbollah's environment. And that really is the key point that we're seeing here. Now, at the same time, again, as Heidi said, the Lebanese government, and indeed I think the Lebanese themselves, are divided over how to deal with this. Some will tell you that they, of course, are weary of war and want to have peace, but at the same time, many do worry about what's going to happen when it comes to actually, this notion of normalization, or this idea of Israel wanting to create some sort of a buffer zone or a security zone or whatever euphemism you want to use for it. It is essentially a repeat of what was done in the 80s up to the 2000s, it seems. And that is the fear right now, or one of the many fears, I should say, right now.
Yeah, I'm going to ask you a quick follow-up on this, Nabih. Your story, I'm very glad Heidi mentioned your exceptional story about the use of AI. And I think one of the very impressive parts of it was the character, your central character, and there were many striking things about that the central character who was killed and got this incredibly dystopian phone call, sort of right before, about 10 minutes before he was killed. He was asked if he wanted to die with his relatives or be killed on his own, and he said on his own, and basically fled. It's a incredibly dramatic reporting. One of the things that struck me about that story, Nabi, and I think both of you touched on this, is that he was someone, you described him as a former fighter, and a retired fighter. Since he was in his 60s, and he was um, from by all accounts, I think that you could trace, was that he was now in the civilian wing, let's say, sort of in the civilian infrastructure of Hezbollah, which is extensive. And one of the things that struck me about that was just this, because it's another echo of the Gaza model of targeting everyone, anyone who is remotely connected to Hamas and to the government arms of Hamas, the civilian wings of Hamas and Gaza. and then extending that out to Lebanon. And the Israelis have done this before in 2006 and previous conflicts in Lebanon as well. But it reminded me of the pager attacks in September of 2024, where here was these booby trap pagers that Israel had distributed to Hezbollah members. Through this, I mean, they had done it through this scheme of getting it into the hands of Hezbollah, and then Hezbollah distributed it to their members. And Hezbollah made clear, I think, on the first day of the attacks, that they had actually distributed pagers not just to fighters, but they had distributed to their civilian workers. So there were medics, there were people who worked in supermarkets, there were people who worked in their banking system, there were people who worked in these civilian roles. And that's one of the ways I would argue certainly Israel committed a war crime that day, fairly clearly of booby. You're not supposed to use booby traps in war. But this blurring of the line that we saw it in Gaza first, and then we've seen in Lebanon with these institutions. So with these militant movements that essentially also have civilian institutions attached to them. And so you have some thoughts on how sort of the complexity of covering that and the complexity of conveying this, because I think a lot of US audiences don't have the sense that Hezbollah actually runs this extensive civilian infrastructure. Either one of it.
I
Nabih,
mean,
if you want to start with.
I must say, I think the fact of the matter is, oh, sorry, I think the fact of the matter is that it is not, all that complicated. I mean, the rules of war mean that combatants are a fair target, right? Whereas the 1 billion roles would not be perhaps acceptable as targets. I mean, again, imagine if, I mean, if an Iranian missile targeted, a bunch of, I guess, U.S. Army administrators, would that be considered okay? Probably not, right? If they were like in a hotel or what have you, right? As we have seen, I mean, a fair amount of complaints from the U.S. military about such attacks. At the same time, it's worth noting that Hezbollah, like Hamas, has a strong social component. This wasn't just a matter of a fighting group, right? This is a group that, again, has a functioning banking system that serves a lot of poor people in Lebanon, that has a functioning educational system, that has, that has many, many social programs that have made it an essential part of the social fabric of South Lebanon, and indeed many other parts of Lebanon as well. Right? To pretend that this is a purely military situation is, I think, wrong. Now, of course, at the same time, we have seen this behavior before, right? Not just in Gaza, but this was the idea that was sort of the organizing theory behind things like the Phoenix program, where you go into a village in Vietnam and you kill everyone, you raise everything, right? And the idea there is that the fighters, will no longer have an environment to operate in. I can understand that at some level, but we should be in no doubt that this is a war crime. I think the interesting thing here is that with Ahmed Turmus, who was the character that was mentioned in the story, he served as a liaison, a rabit in Arabic is the word. And these liaisons, I mean, it should be noted that Hezbollah is involved in the municipalities of each of these southern villages, or I should say most of them. And so when it comes to the matter of electricity provision, water provision, roads, etc., just basic infrastructure, of course Hezbollah is going to be involved because these mayors are, I mean, they're part of the, party in some fashion. So all this is important to note.
Thanks, Heidi.
Yeah, I think it's. Yeah, no, I was just going to say, I think it's unless you've been and worked in Lebanon, it's hard to understand the nature of how much Hezbollah really is a state within a state, right? Like there are, yeah, Hezbollah schools, Hezbollah banking institutions. You go to any, as Nabih mentioned, you go to any council in the south and there is a tie to Hezbollah. They have their own health service. They have their own paramedics who have been targeted relentlessly over the last 2 months and over the last, 2 years, really. But I think unless you have an understanding that, yeah, it's not just a militant armed group. They have MPs in the parliament. There's a whole social structure. And so the idea that you can and should target anybody who is in any way affiliated with them, including journalists, right? They've targeted journalists who work for channels that are affiliated with Hezbollah. And there have been various excuses made for that. Sometimes there's no excuse made. Sometimes it's merely they're Hezbollah. Sometimes there is an excuse to say that one of the senior broadcasters is actually a member of the Radwan force, and here is a photoshopped image that we have produced to prove that. But a lot of the time, there is no justification even to say that these people are fighters. It's their affiliation with Hezbollah, whether civilian or military, is enough.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to Daniel, who's joining us from Tel Aviv. And if you can, Daniel, if you can give us a sense of what life has been like in Israel during these last 2 months of war. I mean, with the ceasefire. I think it's past the phase of people being spending a lot most of their time in shelters, um, and also. If you can talk a bit about the shift in Israeli public opinion about the Iran war, where it was there was very strong support in Israel for launching this war. Um, so maybe some of the shifts in opinion on the war, and I think connected to that is I think we've seen some polling and showing that Israelis think that they've lost all the wars in the region, despite the tremendous destruction that's been caused. So if let's start with that, and we can get to some of the other issues as well.
Sure. In a word, it was surreal here for more than 40 days, because Israeli public life continued kind of normally. I was sitting at a Thai restaurant, and then you get an alert on your phone, and you look around you, and everyone is, I mean, almost, I don't want to use the word zombies, but it really almost looked like people walking in unison toward shelters. And so I left my food on the table and went down to the nearest shelter and crammed in there with 30, 40 other Israelis. And you would hear very loud booms of missiles being intercepted, or oftentimes missiles evading Israel's anti-missile systems and falling, um, causing damage and sometimes killing people. And then you'd wait a little bit and go back out to your food. So that was happening multiple times a day. People were waking up in the middle of the night multiple times. And I've been reporting here for nearly 2 decades, and I have never understood the extent to which this country, Israel, is built upon shelters, basement shelters. I mean, I found myself in the bowels of the Church of Scientology in Jaffa, the traditionally Palestinian city, in the basement next to the purification room, which is also doubles as the bomb shelter. I mean, just totally surreal things that you experience as a person, not just as a journalist covering this war, but as a person. I mean, Israelis, the schools were canceled, so people had kids at home and they were working, and so many Israelis were also enlisted in the military reserves. And so there's a real entanglement whenever there's a war here. And Palestinians in the West Bank were killed by Iranian missile fire, where there are no shelters. So you see how society, you really see the stratification of society in a war like this. In terms of public opinion in Israel, it was really fascinating to see. At the beginning of the war, among Jewish Israelis, polls showed something like over 90% support for the war. The initial knockout, targeting and killing the Iranian supreme leader, after tracking him through traffic cameras, which the Financial Times initially reported, and I also confirmed with an Israeli official. So there was a real sense of wow, talking, like Nabih, and we were talking about some of the high tech strategies that Israel employs in its deadly attacks. That Israeli officials were boasting about that, and I think Israelis felt like, wow, this actually the goal of regime change. Um, Maybe that's possible. We were hearing that. And support among Israelis for the Iran war in the weeks that followed slipped to somewhere around 70-ish% among Jewish Israelis. So still very high, but that is a significant slip. And I think, you saw some interesting things. In the middle of the war, Israel enacted this campaign of hanging up American flags along the highway between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv almost overnight. And just, miles and miles and miles and miles and miles of driving past Ben Gurion Airport in Tel Aviv, going to Jerusalem and seeing these American flags. And the idea was to boost morale, to give Israelis a sense of, okay, you're not alone. Yes, you're um, running into shelters day and night. And yeah, we're telling you that the regime is, steps away from being dismantled and toppled, and yet that's not happening. And so we're going to make you feel that America, at least America, is with us. And I think mirroring what happened along the Gaza war, where you saw people in the first weeks of the war, there were a trickle of, I would say, you know, far left Israeli protesters protesting the war, and police went after them. And gradually, you saw these protests that swelled every weekend to hundreds of thousands of people, even protesting the continuation of the war and saying that Israel needs to prioritize striking a deal with Hamas for hostages. And so I think in parallel, you saw a kind of a mini um, trend here in Israel with people protesting the war in Iran. It was by a lot smaller scale, and it did start with the hardcore um, left-wing activists, but it did grow into slightly more mainstream. And so it was fascinating to see that kind of disillusionment, even among um, mainstream commentators in Israeli media.
Thanks, Daniel. I'm going to ask you kind of two interrelated follow-ups. One about some of the reporting you've done about the surge in settler violence in against Palestinians in the West Bank as the Iran war has unfolded, and also on NPR's continued reporting out of Gaza. You're one of the few U.S. And Western outlets that still has a full-time journalist working for you in Gaza, and sort of some of the um, and tell us a bit about that process and also some of what's emerging because we've also seen, we've seen as we started this conversation, there's so many things going on in so many different places that it's difficult to keep up journalistically and headline wise, but also sometimes you have states that use this as an excuse to ramp up violence, attacks. We've seen some renewal of attacks in Israeli attacks in Gaza. We've seen some reporting about the yellow line, the so-called yellow line expanding. So Israel using this time to expand its hold on territory in Gaza. So whatever you can tell us about that.
Yeah, the changes in the West Bank in the last 3 years since October 7th are astonishing. And since the Iran war, um, even more so, I think, in different ways. Human rights groups tracked Israeli settler attacks in more than 100 Palestinian villages just in the first 3 or 4 weeks of the Iran war, which lasted around 40 days. So throughout that time, there was a major ramp up in Israeli settler attacks. I was out in the West Bank with my colleagues and met a man who was a strawberry farmer, and suddenly essentially a militia of settlers descended upon his village, attacked, and one of them opened fire and killed his young son, and then another one stabbed him, saying, "Die, die, die." And we met him in his home. He was in using crutches. He was recuperating from his wounds, and he speaks fluent Hebrew because he spent years working inside Israel until October 7th, and Israel shut off all Palestinian laborers access to their jobs. And I mean, we've all of us, all our journalists here on this panel have interviewed people during the worst days of their life in grief, crying. Seeing him cry over the death of his son for just a senseless act of hateful violence, and then him switching into Hebrew, speaking with an Israeli colleague, saying, "Where is the Israeli TV and why aren't they talking about this?" And what you did see during the Iran war and the surge of Israeli settler violence was that under pressure from the Trump administration, Netanyahu spoke out and some other Israeli senior leaders spoke out denouncing in words this trend. Even the pro-settler and the settler minister Bezalel Smotrich, who is really the mastermind of so much of the changes that's happening in the West Bank, he wrote an opinion column in a kind of a pro-settler newspaper. But no new policies. Israel continues to equip settlers with military-issued rifles. It still provides army protection for settlers while they are enacting new land grabs. And I think the most fascinating part of my reporting in the West Bank was that all these words and this denunciation is not trickling down to the settlers themselves. So we stopped at a hummus restaurant in the middle of the West Bank, run by Israeli settlers, and I spoke with some, and one conversation really sticks with me. An American-born settler who said, okay, so you met a Palestinian who says his son was killed. Did you see it? He claims he was attacked. Did you see that? So he just didn't even believe that this is a widespread phenomenon. And he said, this is not a mass thing because you're not seeing mass arrests. And it's true, you're not seeing mass arrests, and that's by design. And so there's this surge of violence is backed up by this far right Israeli government. And I think it's very telling that the mainstream, not the hardcore radical hundreds of settlers, but the mainstream settler population don't even register this as a actual phenomenon. And then you also asked, I'll just speak briefly about Gaza, Mohamad. So Anas Baba is our reporter in Gaza. He's been there since before October 7th, reporting for us for NPR, and living the same conditions that of the people he's reporting on. He recently, I'll just give you one example of the most recent story he reported, and actually, it's going to be broadcast tonight on All Things Considered on NPR. He spent 3 days with a crew from Gaza's civil defense recovering bodies of Palestinians, all extended family members of one family, the Abu Nasser family. This was one of the deadliest strikes in the entire Gaza war. That's according to an investigation that we did, and along with air wars, documenting 132 members of this family killed in an instant. And this is just an example of the power of having a journalist on the ground in a place like Gaza, which is still blocked off for independent media access for us getting into Gaza more than 2 years now in an unprecedented manner. But Anas was there and just documenting, the fact that there is one excavator machine in Gaza, one functioning digger machine for the kind of work of recovering what is believed to be thousands of bodies still under rubble. Right? We're more than 6 months into the alleged, or the ceasefire, which is not a ceasefire. And this family of 132 members killed in an instant. This was a strike in October of 2024. So think about it, nearly a year and a half later. What remains, and I'm sorry for the graphic image, are skeletons inside clothing, found in the last moments of their life, under, concrete slabs. And so I think it's just important to remember and to report the gruesome reality and those details. The reality that thousands of bodies are still not buried, have not been given a final resting place, and Israel does not permit the entry of more machinery, and that's part of the bigger policy, which is that Israel does not allow any major rehabilitation, any major reconstruction, so long as Hamas is not disarmed.